They thought he was just an actor. She set a trap to humiliate him in front of the world. But when Keanu Reeves solved the impossible equation and exposed a dangerous conspiracy, everything changed. How did a simple classroom challenge lead to a global revelation? Stay tuned. The truth is more shocking than you think. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. It was a crisp autumn morning at Ashton Ivy University, the kind of day that usually sparked excitement on campus. But inside the sleek, glass-walled lecture hall of the mathematics building, the mood was unusually sharp, almost electric. Students shuffled to their seats, notebooks ready, whispers of anticipation rippling through the crowd. Today's advanced calculus seminar, taught by the infamous Professor Linda Martinez, promised to be memorable. Professor Martinez was known for two things: her unapologetically sharp intellect and her disdain for what she called celebrity pseudo-intellectuals. She stood at the front of the room, tall and poised, her navy blazer sharply pressed, auburn hair tied in a strict bun. Her gaze swept across the class like a hawk circling prey. "Today," she began, her tone crisp, "we examine what separates true genius from media fantasy." She tapped her marker against the whiteboard, where complex rocket trajectory equations already sprawled in neat rows. Society loves to celebrate so-called Renaissance men, actors, public figures who dabble in science. Some even believe they have profound intellect. She paused, a smirk tugged at her mouth. "Take Keanu Reeves," she said with a chuckle, prompting scattered laughter from the class. "He's a household name, but fame doesn't equal intelligence." At the back of the room, a student sat quietly, head down. He wore a dark hoodie under a brown leather jacket, a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He didn't laugh. He stayed still, fingers tapping the side of his worn notebook, as if keeping time to an unheard rhythm. Professor Martinez continued, "You see, knowledge isn't something you memorize for a film script. It's earned through rigor, study, sacrifice." She clicked the cap off her marker and, with a flourish, began writing on the board. A collective hush fell over the room. The problem she scrawled was monstrous. A three-dimensional rocket trajectory equation involving gravitational anomalies, atmospheric drag, and variable thrust calculations. It looked like a spider's web of numbers and Greek letters. Even the top students blinked in confusion. "This," she said, capping the marker with a snap, "is an unsolved problem, a theoretical model for interplanetary travel using only raw fuel efficiency. I've posed it at conferences. No one has solved it." Linda turned back to the class, her eyes sharp with challenge. "Keanu Reeves couldn't solve this in a lifetime." In the third row, Tara Chen, a sophomore journalism major and aspiring investigative reporter, raised an eyebrow. She'd attended Martinez's lectures before, but something today felt different. She slipped her phone out, screen dimmed, and started recording. Her instincts told her something newsworthy was about to happen. "Any volunteers?" Linda asked, her tone mocking. "Don't be shy. If a movie star can do it, surely one of you can try." The room was silent. Students exchanged uneasy glances. The equations were impossible. No one moved, except for one. In the very back, the student in the hoodie lifted his head. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand. Professor Martinez froze. "Yes?" she said, skeptical. The man stood. As he walked forward, students shifted to get a better look. He was tall, his movements smooth and precise. As he reached the front of the room, he tugged his cap higher, revealing a familiar face, one that had graced countless movie screens. Gasps echoed across the lecture hall. It was Keanu Reeves. Linda's smug expression flickered for just a second. "You're him," she said flatly, trying to keep control. Keanu smiled politely. "I prefer just Keanu," he said, voice calm but carrying an undertone of confidence. He took the marker from her hand without waiting for permission. His fingers brushed hers briefly. Hers were stiff, cold. Turning to the board, Keanu studied the equations for only a moment before moving decisively. He erased part of the formula, replacing it with a corrected variable, then another. His strokes were sure, methodical. Within minutes, he rewrote half the equation. The class sat frozen in shock. Tara leaned forward, her phone trembling in her grip. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. This wasn't just movie star charm. Keanu worked like a seasoned mathematician, eyes flickering with laser focus. Linda tried to interrupt. What are you? Keanu didn't break rhythm. Your gravitational coefficient was off, he said calmly. You factored in Earth's rotational velocity incorrectly. It throws the entire projection out of sync. He completed the equation, then stepped back. You were close, he added, almost kindly. Professor Martinez stood speechless. The class erupted into whispers, some capturing photos, others simply staring as though they'd witnessed a magician reveal his trick and then do something better. Tara stopped recording. She knew what she had, a front-page story. Keanu turned, setting the marker down gently. He faced Linda with an expression that was neither smug nor condescending. Just understanding. May I sit? He asked. Linda nodded numbly. Keanu returned to his seat in the back, quietly. The equation remained on the board, a testament to something nobody expected. Keanu Reeves wasn't pretending. He was the real thing, and it was only the beginning. The room remained frozen as Keanu Reeves stood in front of the board, marker in hand. For a long moment, no one breathed. The complex rocket trajectory equation, intended as an unsolvable problem, loomed large across the whiteboard. And there he was, standing calmly under the glare of fluorescent lights, studying the problem as if it were a familiar poem he hadn't read in years. Professor Linda Martinez crossed her arms, her smirk lingering at the edges of her mouth. Be my guest, she said, masking her unease with false confidence. But I should warn you, this isn't an acting exercise. Keanu didn't respond. He simply glanced at the matrix of variables, his dark eyes narrowing with precision. The tension in the room thickened. Tara Chen's hands were sweating as she held her phone steady, continuing to record. She'd never seen anyone command silence without saying a word. Then, with a quiet click of the marker against the board, Keanu made his first move. He erased a small section of the equation, circling a variable Linda had written, and replaced it with a correction. There was no hesitation, no second glance. He was sure. The equation shifted subtly, the balance of the formula finding new harmony with the correction. A murmur rippled through the class. Wait, whispered one of the grad students, scribbling on his notebook. He's factoring in differential velocity based on gravitational lensing. That's brilliant. Linda's smirk faded, her brow furrowing as she took a step closer, reading his changes. That's not, she began, but her voice trailed off. It was. And it was more accurate than her own calculation. Keanu moved methodically, his handwriting neat and deliberate. Every correction he made didn't just fix the model, it improved it. What had been a theoretical framework for an orbital transfer, once prone to inefficiency, now resembled an elegant solution, something not only functional but optimized. 10 minutes passed. He finished the equation with a final notation, stepping back without ceremony. The lecture hall was silent. Linda's mouth opened slightly as she scanned the new equation, tracing its flow from start to finish. She tried to find a flaw, a mistake, anything that would allow her to regain her footing. But there was nothing. She knew it. The entire room knew it. Who? Linda finally managed, her voice losing its sharp edge. Keanu turned, lifting his cap slowly. His dark hair was slightly tousled beneath it. He met Linda's gaze, calm and unshaken. Keanu, he said simply. Keanu Reeves. A collective gasp swept through the class. Holy, one of the students whispered, trailing off as others began murmuring. Tara could barely contain herself, her recording capturing the exact moment Linda's composure cracked. President Wilson, who had been discreetly standing by the door for most of the session, stepped inside with measured authority. His presence brought an added weight to the moment, his silver-rimmed glasses flashing under the overhead lights. "Is there a problem here, Professor Martinez?" Wilson asked, his tone a mixture of concern and curiosity. Linda turned toward him, struggling to find the words. "No, President Wilson," she said, but it was clear she was reeling. She gestured weakly toward the board. "Mr. Reeves appears to have solved the problem?" Wilson raised an eyebrow, glancing at Keanu and then at the equation. Though he wasn't a mathematician, even he could recognize the room's collective shock. "Impressive," he said quietly, offering Keanu a brief, respectful nod. Tara stood, energized by the atmosphere. "Sir, can I ask, how long have you been studying advanced calculus?" she asked Keanu, her voice cutting through the murmurs. Keanu smiled faintly, pocketing his hands. "Since I was young. My mother taught me early, and I've always had an interest in orbital mechanics." He shrugged slightly, as if solving near-impossible math problems wasn't as big a deal as everyone believed. Linda cleared her throat. "Mr. Reeves." "Keanu," she began, forcing herself to meet his gaze again. "Would you be willing to speak privately after class?" There was a tightness in her voice, not quite surrender but not far from it. She was no longer mocking him. Now she was intrigued, and perhaps humbled. Keanu tilted his head thoughtfully, then nodded. "Of course," he said. President Wilson interjected before anything more could be said. "We'll need to discuss the implications of this demonstration," he said, addressing both Linda and Keanu. "The media is going to pick this up whether we want them to or not." Keanu's expression shifted to something a little more serious. "That's not my intention," he said. "I didn't come here for attention." Wilson studied him for a beat, then gave a nod. "Understood." The class began to stir again as Keanu returned to his seat in the back row, picking up his notebook and sliding it into his messenger bag. He kept his head down, avoiding the dozens of curious glances now aimed his way. Linda turned back to the board, staring at the completed equation as if seeing it for the first time. There was a subtle shift in her posture, less defensive, more contemplative. She'd wanted to make a point about privilege and pretense. Instead, she'd been confronted with authentic genius. Tara stopped recording. She glanced down at her phone, knowing she had captured a historic moment. But something told her there was more to this story than a viral clip. Linda closed her laptop with a sharp snap and cleared her throat. "Class dismissed," she announced. Nobody moved. For a few heartbeats, the room remained suspended in that moment of disbelief and reevaluation. Then, slowly, students gathered their belongings, whispering in excited tones as they filed out of the room. As the last student left, Linda stood quietly at her lectern. President Wilson had already slipped away. Only Keanu and Tara remained. "You surprised me," Linda said quietly, approaching Keanu as he slung his bag over his shoulder. Keanu gave a small smile. "I'm used to that," he replied. "I shouldn't have underestimated you," she admitted. He regarded her for a moment. "People do," he said. "But we're all students, aren't we?" Linda smiled faintly. "Yes," she said. "Yes, we are." She gestured toward her office door. "Shall we?" Keanu nodded and followed her toward a private discussion that neither of them realized would soon uncover something far bigger than math. Linda Martinez's office was a paradox of precision and chaos. Books on theoretical physics and applied mathematics were stacked in neat rows along one side of the room. On the other, loose papers, research notes, and crumpled post-it reminders littered her desk. A chalkboard filled with complex equations stood against the wall, and in the center of it all, Linda stood with her arms folded, watching Keanu Reeves with a gaze that was somewhere between suspicion and curiosity. Keanu sat across from her, relaxed but attentive. He didn't seem fazed by the skepticism in her eyes, nor by the silent tension that hung between them. "So," Linda began, breaking the silence, "you're an actor and a mathematician?" Keanu's lips curved into a faint smile. "I'm a student," he replied. "Always have been." Linda arched an eyebrow, unconvinced but intrigued. "But that solution," she motioned toward the lecture hall they'd just left, "that wasn't something you learn in your spare time." Keanu shrugged slightly. "I was never formally trained, if that's what you mean," he said. "But I've had good teachers. My mother was one. And I've had time. I read, I study. Math helps me make sense of things." Linda's gaze softened for a moment. She studied him more closely now, as if recalibrating her perception of who he was. "You're serious," she murmured. "You really are." "I wouldn't have come to your lecture if I wasn't," Keanu said. "I've read your papers on nonlinear equations and carbon capture optimization. They're impressive." That got her attention. She blinked in surprise. "You've read them?" Keanu nodded. "Your 2023 paper on recursive algorithms for scalable carbon absorption. Innovative work," he said. "But there's a flaw in the model." Linda's eyes narrowed, but it wasn't anger this time. It was something closer to dread. "A flaw?" she repeated. Keanu leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You assume a linear rate of absorption as the pressure differential increases," he explained. "But in reality, the absorption curve flattens beyond a certain threshold. Your model works on small-scale systems, but scaling it up creates instability." For a moment, Linda didn't respond. She simply stared at him, processing what he had said. Then slowly she stood and walked to the chalkboard. Grabbing a piece of chalk, she began to write, replicating the equation in question. As she worked through it, Keanu rose from his seat and approached. He gently took the chalk from her fingers and made an adjustment, just a small one, but enough to change everything. The equation balanced perfectly. Linda stared at the board, then back at him. Her skepticism gave way to genuine astonishment. This changes the entire model," she said quietly. Keanu nodded. "It makes it scalable," he replied, "and stable." Linda exhaled slowly, setting the chalk down. "You could have embarrassed me in front of the entire class," she said, "but you didn't." Keanu gave a modest shrug. "It wasn't about proving anything," he said. "It was about sharing an idea." For the first time, Linda smiled. It was faint, almost reluctant, but it was there. "I misjudged you," she admitted. Before Keanu could respond, there was a soft knock at the door. Tara Chen stepped inside, holding her phone close to her chest. "Sorry," she said. "I just thought you should see this." Linda frowned. "See what?" Tara glanced at Keanu before continuing. "When you were working on the equation earlier, I was recording, obviously, but I noticed something strange." She tapped her phone screen and played a video. It showed the lecture hall from earlier, the camera panning slowly across the room. At first, it seemed ordinary. Students murmuring, Linda pacing at the front, Keanu working at the board. But then, Tara zoomed in, on the back row. There, seated with his phone in his hand, was Professor Victor Hammond, chair of the mathematics department. His fingers moved rapidly across his phone, texting furiously. At one point, he looked up, glanced directly at Tara's camera, then quickly turned away. Linda's expression darkened. "Victor was in the lecture?" she asked, her voice sharp. Tara nodded. "And he was texting non-stop. I zoomed in as much as I could. It looked like he was taking photos of your equations." Keanu's jaw tightened. "You think he's the leak?" he said. Linda's mind was already racing. "Victor's been pushing me to share my latest research with his contacts," she said. "He claimed it was for cyber defense initiatives, but I didn't trust him." Keanu crossed his arms, his gaze thoughtful. "Your carbon capture model," he said, "with the right modifications, it's not just about capturing carbon. It can be used to create dense energy fields. It's theoretical propulsion, or worse. Linda's face paled. Weaponization, she whispered. Keanu nodded grimly. Someone wants your equations, he said, and they're willing to steal them. For a long moment there was silence. Then Linda straightened, her jaw set with determination. I'm not going to let my work be used like that, she said. Keanu's expression softened slightly. Then we'll protect it, he said. Together. Tara stepped forward. I can help, she offered. I'm already recording everything. If we keep this quiet, we can find out who's involved and stop them. Linda gave her an appreciative nod. Thank you, Tara, she said. We'll need all the help we can get. Keanu turned back to Linda. We work quietly, he said. No public announcements, no data transfers. Keep everything analog. Linda smirked faintly. I've always preferred chalkboards anyway. Keanu smiled back. Good. As they gathered their materials and prepared to leave, there was a new sense of purpose in the room. They had started the day as adversaries, skeptic and subject. But now they were allies, bound by a shared goal. Tara tucked her phone away, glancing between them. So, what's next? Keanu glanced at Linda. We run the numbers, he said, and we find out who's watching. Linda nodded. Let's get to work. As they stepped out of the office, the corridor was empty, but they all knew that wouldn't last for long. What had begun as a classroom confrontation was becoming something far more dangerous and far more important. The university's advanced research lab was empty after hours. Long shadows stretched across the floor, broken only by the faint glow of monitors and the scribble of chalk on blackboards. Keanu Reeves stood in front of one of those boards, sleeves rolled up, carefully adjusting an equation. His normally calm expression was focused, his dark eyes intense as he scanned the complex variables. Linda Martinez sat nearby, tapping furiously on her keyboard, cross-checking Keanu's adjustments against her simulation software. Her earlier skepticism had given way to a grudging respect, and now, late at night, they worked together with the easy efficiency of seasoned collaborators. It's stable, Linda finally said, her voice tight with fatigue but tinged with excitement. The energy absorption curve follows the new model, but with these numbers. She paused, her brows knitting. If someone repurposed it, this could become a targeting system. High precision, high risk. Keanu nodded grimly. It's not just about reducing carbon emissions anymore. Their work had begun as a refinement of Linda's equations for carbon capture, models designed to help combat climate change by maximizing carbon absorption in the atmosphere. But the deeper they dug, the more they realized how adaptable the equations were. Too adaptable. In the wrong hands, her formulas could guide autonomous drones, enabling them to track and strike with pinpoint accuracy over vast distances. What started as a model for planetary healing had the potential to become a blueprint for destruction. Keanu dropped his chalk, wiped his hands on a rag, and leaned against the desk. Have you told anyone else about this? Linda shook her head. Only you, she hesitated, glancing toward her laptop. Except Professor Hammond, a few months ago. Keanu's jaw tightened. What did you give him? Just preliminary models, Linda answered quickly. Simplified versions, nothing like this. She paused again, visibly uneasy. But he's been pressing for more lately. Said a lab overseas could fund my research if I agreed to a joint project. Keanu pushed away from the desk. He's trying to get your data. Linda sighed. I thought he was just opportunistic. Now I'm not so sure. As if on cue, Keanu's phone buzzed softly on the desk. He picked it up, glancing at the screen. It was a text from his cousin, Dr. Marcus Reeves, a theoretical physicist working on defense contracts in Washington. Marcus, you were right. Hammond's name came up in a classified intel report. Foreign cyber groups flagged. Keanu exhaled slowly and looked at Linda. Hammond's not just opportunistic, he's dangerous. Linda stood abruptly, pacing across the room. We need to secure the data, now. Keanu was already 2 steps ahead. He pulled out a battered notebook and handed it to her. Analog encryption, he explained. Nothing online, Nothing in the cloud. She flipped through the pages, impressed despite herself. It was a cipher system, handwritten instructions on how to encode and decode data without relying on digital systems. Old school. "Where did you learn this?" Linda asked. Keanu smiled faintly. "An old friend. Said it was the only way to keep secrets safe." For the next few hours, they worked quietly but intensely, transferring Linda's most sensitive data to encrypted hard drives while simultaneously transcribing critical components onto paper, stored in Keanu's personal notebooks. By dawn, their eyes were bloodshot and their hands cramped, but the files were secured. Tara Chen arrived just as they were finishing, clutching her laptop tightly. "You'll want to see this," she said. Linda and Keanu exchanged glances before moving to where Tara had set up her equipment. She pulled up a screen recording of Hammond's most recent network activity. "I've been monitoring his university account," Tara explained. "He's already accessed your old files from the archive servers." "Which ones?" Linda asked sharply. Tara scrolled down. "The earlier iterations of your absorption algorithm and your unrefined trajectory models." Linda swore under her breath. "That's enough to get him close," she muttered. "If he understands the variables, he could reverse engineer the rest." Keanu rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Or he already has." They stared at each other, the gravity of the situation sinking in. If Hammond sold those equations, or worse, if they were already in the wrong hands, the consequences could be catastrophic. "We need to confront him," Linda said, her voice low but determined. Keanu shook his head. "Not yet. We need proof, and we need to know who's buying." Tara looked up from her screen. "I might have a way," she said cautiously. "He's scheduled to give a guest lecture at the International Cybersecurity Symposium next week. If we can access his device during the event, I can trace his communication." Linda glanced at Keanu. "You trust her?" Keanu nodded. "I do." Tara grinned. "I'm flattered." They finalized their plan, with Tara taking point on surveillance while Keanu and Linda continued refining the encryption and working through the theoretical applications of Linda's models. If they could get ahead of Hammond, they might stand a chance at shutting down the leak. But the stakes were rising. One night, as they reviewed a fresh set of projections, Linda leaned back in her chair and sighed heavily. "You know, I started this project to save the planet," she said. "Not this." Keanu smiled faintly. "Saving the planet sometimes looks like stopping people from destroying it." Linda chuckled softly, rubbing her eyes. "Never thought I'd be working with you." He shrugged. "Life's funny like that." They lapsed into a comfortable silence, both of them aware of how much had changed in just a few days. Trust had formed where there was once suspicion, and now they were fighting not just for their research, but for the future of their work. And perhaps something even greater. As they packed up for the night, Keanu slipped his notebook into his backpack and glanced at Linda. "Be ready," he said quietly. "Once we move on Hammond, there's no going back." Linda nodded. "I'm ready." Tara glanced at them both as they walked toward the door. "You know," she said with a grin, "this could make one hell of a story." Keanu smiled. "Let's make sure it has a good ending." And with that, they stepped out into the night, knowing that the next moves they made could change everything. The plan was dangerous, risky, but it was the only way to expose Professor Victor Hammond and shut down the espionage network targeting Linda's research. Linda Martinez knew it. Keanu Reeves knew it. Tara Chen, watching from her laptop screen across the table, knew it too. They had spent sleepless nights crafting a trap that would be both convincing and damning. The bait? A sophisticated but ultimately flawed data set, carefully designed to appear legitimate but embedded with subtle errors that only a true expert would notice. If Hammond passed this data to his foreign contacts, it would be clear evidence of his betrayal. "This is it," Linda said, sliding the encrypted flash drive across the table toward Keanu. "The fake models are ready." Keanu took the drive with a nod. His expression was serious but calm. Let's get it into his hands. Tara chimed in. He's scheduled to be in his office for 2 hours tomorrow, preparing for his symposium lecture. That's our window. Keanu slid the drive into his inner jacket pocket. I'll deliver it personally. Linda looked up sharply. Are you sure? We could. He shook his head. It has to be me. The next day, Keanu approached Hammond's office like any other visitor. He carried a thin folder in one hand, dressed not as a movie star but as an understated academic. Casual blazer, glasses perched on his nose, and a calm, scholarly air. Thomas Johnson, his ever-reliable chauffeur and informal bodyguard, lingered out in the hall, keeping a watchful eye. Inside, Hammond glanced up from his desk with polite curiosity. Mr. Reeves, or should I say, Dr. Reeves, I hear you've become quite the mathematician. Keanu smiled politely but didn't take the bait. Professor Martinez asked me to deliver some updated work. She thought you'd find this interesting. He handed over the folder. Inside was a hard copy of the fabricated data, complete with equations, diagrams, and impressive calculations. Keanu placed the flash drive alongside it. The digital files are there as well. Hammond flipped through the papers, his eyes gleaming. Brilliant, he murmured, nodding in approval. Thank you for bringing this to me. Keanu gave a polite nod. Linda said you'd appreciate the new insights. Then he left. Simple, clean, no theatrics. But they all knew that Hammond wouldn't be able to resist. He'd take the bait. He had to. That night, Tara monitored Hammond's communications from a secure location. Keanu and Linda sat beside her, staring at the screen in silence as lines of code and transmission logs scrolled past. He's sending something, Tara whispered, excitement lacing her voice. It's going out now. Encrypted, standard protocols. But it's him. Keanu leaned in. Destination? Eastern Europe. Proxy servers, but I'll track them. It was the proof they needed. Hammond had taken the bait. Hook, line, and sinker. Linda slumped back in her chair, a mixture of relief and sadness washing over her. I trusted him once, she said softly. Keanu didn't reply. He simply placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder and gave it a firm squeeze. The next morning, President Wilson convened a closed-door meeting in his office. Linda and Keanu sat opposite him, Tara nearby with a laptop open. Thomas stood at the door, stoic and vigilant. President Wilson's expression was grave. We have everything? We do, Keanu confirmed. Tara traced Hammond's transmissions. The fake data was passed to at least 2 foreign intelligence operatives posing as academic researchers. Wilson exhaled heavily. I'll notify the FBI. Within hours, federal agents moved in. Hammond was arrested in the middle of his symposium lecture, mid-sentence, as he pontificated about global collaboration in research. Linda and Keanu watched from afar. It wasn't satisfying. It wasn't triumphant. It was necessary. Later, President Wilson addressed the university's board. He praised the quick actions of Professor Martinez, Keanu Reeves, and Tara Chen in protecting intellectual property and national security. He spoke about integrity and vigilance, and he issued new protocols for data security and research departments. But Keanu had refused to appear in person. No cameras, no interviews. When reporters asked for comments, he issued a brief written statement. This isn't about fame. It's about protecting knowledge. We all have a responsibility to safeguard discoveries that can either help or harm humanity. Days later, Linda found herself sitting alone in her office, staring out the window at the quad. Students passed by, their lives untouched by the whirlwind that had just happened behind closed doors. She had started this journey cynical, convinced that fame and fortune clouded judgment. And yet, Keanu Reeves had proved her wrong, time and again. He wasn't just brilliant, he was principled. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Keanu stepped inside carrying 2 cups of coffee. Black, right? He asked. She smiled faintly. Right. He handed her the cup and settled into the chair across from her. They sat in silence for a moment, sipping their drinks. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? He asked, genuinely puzzled. For proving me wrong, she replied, about everything. Keanu chuckled softly. I've spent a lifetime being underestimated. Linda shook her head. It's not underestimation. It's the assumption that people with influence don't care about responsibility. He nodded slowly. I care. I know, she said, her voice softer now. I see that. They sat in thoughtful silence for a while, the weight of the past week settling into something quieter, something lighter. Later that evening, Keanu and Linda met with Tara at a small cafe off campus. They reviewed the final version of Linda's carbon capture equations, refined, perfected, and securely submitted to the UN Climate Coalition. It was the culmination of their work, and it would make a difference. What's next? Tara asked, sipping her tea. Linda glanced at Keanu. We keep working. Keanu nodded. And we make sure it stays in the right hands. Tara smiled. You two make a good team. Linda smirked. Who knew? Keanu shrugged with his trademark humility. Sometimes, the unexpected collaborations are the best ones. 2 weeks later, the UN Climate Coalition formally adopted Linda's models into their global carbon reduction initiatives. Keanu declined any mention of his contributions in the official reports. And when international journalists tried to dig up details about Hammond's espionage, Keanu simply said, "This was about the work, not about me." But for Linda Martinez, it was about both. Keanu's mind had surprised her, his ethics had impressed her, but his humility had earned her respect. As they stood together at the coalition's private reception, watching leaders discuss policy and science, Linda leaned in and said, "You know, I think you might just be the real deal." Keanu chuckled. "I'm still learning." She smiled. "We all are." And as they shook hands with diplomats and scientists from around the world, Linda realized that what had started as a public challenge had become something far more meaningful, a partnership, a shared mission. The work wasn't over, but it was in good hands. The grand auditorium buzzed with anticipation. An international symposium on climate science was being held at the United Nations headquarters in Geneva. Leading scientists, environmentalists, and policymakers from around the globe were gathered, their attention focused on the next big breakthrough in climate technology. Keanu Reeves and Professor Linda Martinez stood backstage, quietly observing the scene. Linda, dressed in a simple but elegant black suit, clutched a small flash drive containing the finalized equations that she and Keanu had painstakingly developed. Keanu, wearing his trademark understated style, dark blazer, no tie, stood beside her, exuding calm confidence. "You ready?" Keanu asked, his voice low and warm. Linda exhaled slowly, glancing down at the flash drive. "I think so. Are you?" He smiled faintly. "I've never presented at a symposium before, but hey, first time for everything." Linda chuckled despite herself. She had come a long way since the day she thought Keanu Reeves was just a celebrity living off fame. Now she saw the depth of his intelligence and his unwavering sense of responsibility. When their names were announced, a wave of whispers rippled through the audience. Keanu Reeves was here. But this wasn't a publicity stunt, and the attendees soon realized it. As Linda began the presentation, Keanu stood by her side, offering key insights and explanations that demonstrated his profound understanding of the mathematics. Linda walked the audience through their breakthrough carbon capture model. Unlike current technologies, their system was based on a dynamic algorithm that adapted in real time to varying atmospheric conditions, making it far more efficient and scalable than anything in existence. Then Keanu took the podium. With clear, concise language, he explained how the algorithm could be used in both stationary carbon capture plants and mobile units, integrated into ships, aircraft, and even spacecraft. He spoke about how math wasn't just numbers on a page, it was a language that could bridge worlds, solve crises, and connect humanity. By the time they finished, the entire auditorium was on its feet, offering thunderous applause. Later that evening, as the sun set over Lake Geneva, Keanu and Linda stood on a balcony overlooking the city. "That was surreal," Linda admitted, sipping a glass of sparkling water. Keanu gave a half smile. "You crushed it." She glanced at him, something unreadable in her gaze. "So did you." They shared a quiet moment, understanding the significance of what they had achieved together. Within weeks, NASA contacted them. An official request for collaboration arrived through Linda's email, inviting both her and Keanu to assist on a new mission. The email read, "Professor Martinez and Mr. Reeves, we have been following your work with great interest. We believe your adaptive algorithms could revolutionize our spaceflight trajectory planning and life support systems in long-term missions. We invite you to join our task force for the upcoming Europa exploration program. Sincerely, Director Alan Chen, NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory." Linda stared at the message, her heart pounding. Keanu, standing behind her, read over her shoulder. "Europa," he murmured. "That's ambitious." She turned to him. "Do we say yes?" He didn't hesitate. "Absolutely." As they immersed themselves in their new work with NASA, Tara Chen continued to document their journey. Her latest piece, published in an internationally respected journal, was titled "Beyond Fame: The Ethics of Knowledge in the Age of Influence." In the article, she chronicled not only their technical contributions, but the ethical dilemmas they faced along the way. The choice to deny lucrative military applications in favor of humanitarian goals, the responsibility to protect knowledge from exploitation, and the challenge of bridging two very different worlds. Her conclusion read, "Keanu Reeves and Linda Martinez remind us that knowledge is not just power, it is stewardship. In their alliance, we see the importance of humility in genius and the courage it takes to place humanity above personal gain." The article went viral, inspiring debates in academic circles and drawing praise from thought leaders worldwide. But Keanu wasn't interested in the spotlight. Between their collaborative work with NASA and ongoing contributions to the UN Climate Coalition, he quietly funded scholarships for underprivileged students pursuing STEM fields. Working with Linda, they created the Martinez-Reeves Scholarship Fund, which provided full rides to students from marginalized communities, students who showed not only academic promise, but a deep commitment to using science for good. One of their first recipients was a young girl from the Bronx who dreamed of becoming an aerospace engineer. Another was a refugee from Syria who had taught himself calculus while living in a camp. Each story reminded Keanu why he did this. It wasn't about proving anything to the world. It was about giving others the opportunity to make a difference. On Wednesdays, Keanu visited a local children's learning center in Brooklyn. No cameras, no publicity. Just Keanu, sitting cross-legged on the floor, teaching kids basic algebra and geometry, sneaking in lessons about resilience, kindness, and curiosity. Linda joined him once. Watching him patiently explain the Fibonacci sequence to a group of wide-eyed children, she felt a sense of awe she rarely experienced in the world of academia. Afterward, as they packed up, she turned to him. "You really are a mystery." He smiled. "I'm just a guy who likes math." She shook her head, amused. "I owe you an apology." He raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For judging you before I knew you," she said. "For assuming that fame and substance couldn't exist in the same person." Keanu tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. "It's okay. I think we both had something to learn." She laughed softly. "I guess we did." The next month, during a televised panel discussion on ethical research at MIT, Linda made a public apology. In front of students, faculty, and millions watching online, she addressed her past skepticism. "I once believed that celebrity and intellect were mutually exclusive. I was wrong. Keanu Reeves is not just a brilliant mind. He's one of the most ethical collaborators I've ever worked with. And I'm proud to call him my partner in this work." Keanu, sitting quietly next to her, gave a small nod. He wasn't interested in applause, but the moment mattered. Their work continued. At NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, they refined their trajectory equations, enabling more precise space missions with reduced fuel consumption. The carbon capture technology was rolled out in developing nations first, offering affordable solutions to combat climate change. Their scholarship fund expanded, eventually partnering with universities across the globe. And through it all, Keanu and Linda remained humble, committed to their work, and united by a shared purpose: to use knowledge responsibly and compassionately. One day, after a lecture at Oxford, a student approached Keanu. Nervous but determined, she asked, "How did you become so good at math?" Keanu chuckled softly. "By making a lot of mistakes and by having good teachers." Linda, standing nearby, smiled. As they walked away from the university, Keanu glanced at her. "You know, we've still got work to do." She nodded. "Always." They shared a quiet moment of understanding. They were no longer just collaborators, they were a team. And the frontier ahead was vast. The sleek glass walls of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory glowed faintly under the soft lights of the control center. Screens displayed streams of data from distant probes, Voyager, New Horizons, and the latest unmanned missions beyond the asteroid belt. Keanu Reeves sat hunched over a console, his brow furrowed in concentration. Beside him, Professor Linda Martinez sifted through an endless array of telemetry logs, her fingers flying over the keyboard. For weeks, they had worked alongside NASA's brightest minds, refining spacecraft trajectories with their adaptive algorithms. The simulations were nearly flawless, each new calculation offering faster, more fuel-efficient paths through space. But there was something strange. Keanu sat back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "It doesn't add up," he murmured. Linda glanced over. "What does—" He tapped the screen, highlighting an anomalous data point in the telemetry logs from Europa Explorer 4. "Look at the signal latency from their last course correction. There's no gravitational explanation for the deviation, and the correction wasn't automated." Linda studied it, her expression tightening. "Manual input? Impossible. The AI would have logged it." Keanu shook his head. "It's not an internal adjustment. Something external influenced it." They fell into a heavy silence. In the quiet hum of the lab, the realization hung between them like a charged wire. Later that night, after cross-referencing countless data sets, they gathered in Dr. Marcus Reeves' private office. Marcus, Keanu's cousin and one of NASA's top astrophysicists, had always been cautious, but when they showed him the telemetry anomalies from multiple spacecraft, each displaying slight, inexplicable trajectory nudges, his demeanor shifted from skeptical to grave. "I've seen patterns like these before," Marcus said quietly, "but no one dared publish them." Linda's breath caught. "Why not?" Marcus folded his hands. "Because the math suggests one of two things. Either an advanced non-human intelligence is subtly guiding our probes, or a human civilization, more advanced than any government is willing to admit, is operating in deep space." Keanu absorbed the information without flinching. "Either way," he said slowly, "someone's hiding." They debated the implications late into the night. If they pursued this anomaly, they could be exposing something massive, far beyond their understanding. But to ignore it? That wasn't who they were. Linda stared at the glowing equation on her tablet, tracing the numbers with her thumb. "What if we're not ready for this truth?" she whispered. Keanu leaned forward, his gaze steady. "The question isn't whether we're ready, it's whether we're willing to act responsibly." Her eyes met his, and in them she saw a reflection of her own uncertainty and courage. They were no longer the skeptical professor and the underestimated actor. They were partners facing something bigger than either of them had ever imagined. They made their decision. They would continue to explore the anomaly, but they would guard their findings with the utmost care. Knowledge without ethics was dangerous. They both agreed on that. As their investigation deepened, Tara Chen returned to the story. Having become a well-respected investigative journalist after covering Keanu and Linda's earlier discoveries, She was drawn back by whispers from insiders at NASA. Tara's latest piece, titled Guided by Invisible Hands, Are We Alone in Space?, was a carefully balanced exposé. In it, she referenced the anomaly without making wild claims, but encouraged readers to think critically about the data. At the end of her article, she left a subtle breadcrumb for curious viewers. For more on Keanu Reeves and Professor Linda Martinez's groundbreaking collaborations, Stories That Led Us Here, explore their earlier work on carbon capture and ethics in science. Their journey is as extraordinary as the math itself. The link led to a curated playlist of previous stories on the YouTube channel, subtly reinforcing the connection between their current adventure and the moral lessons of their past. Meanwhile, Jesse made his first appearance at NASA. Once a member of the Iron Serpent's biker gang, Jesse had turned his life around after his encounter with Keanu in a dusty small-town diner. He'd worked tirelessly, earning a place in a technical support program that NASA had recently expanded. He arrived at JPL one crisp morning, carrying nothing but a worn backpack and a determination to prove himself. Keanu noticed him immediately. "Jesse," Keanu said, extending a hand. "Glad you're here." Jesse shook it firmly, his voice steady. "I never thought I'd end up in a place like this." Linda glanced between them, intrigued. "You two know each other?" Keanu nodded. He's a reminder that second chances matter. Jesse was assigned to the data encryption team, helping protect Linda and Keanu's research from prying eyes. His redemption arc, subtle but powerful, symbolized the growing web of trust and integrity surrounding their work. For viewers new to the channel, this glimpse of Jesse served as a hook, encouraging them to explore his earlier journey. His transformation from reckless gang member to guardian of sensitive data was a story of hope, and of how compassion and courage could rewrite a person's destiny. In a quiet moment, Keanu and Linda stood on the observation deck of the Deep Space Telemetry Center. Below them, data streams flowed like rivers of light across massive monitors. "What if we're not alone?" Linda asked softly. Keanu's gaze remained fixed on the stars. "Then we need to be the kind of people worth meeting." Linda smiled faintly. "You always have the right words." "No," Keanu said with a gentle shrug. "I just listen." As their work continued, the anomaly became more defined. Linda's calculations confirmed it. The trajectory shifts weren't random. They followed a pattern, one that hinted at intelligence. But they agreed not to announce it. Not yet. The world wasn't ready, and neither were they. Instead, they poured their energy into finishing their work with NASA and refining their climate algorithms. One discovery at a time. Talia Reynolds made a brief appearance during one of their conference streams, asking thoughtful questions during a Q&A session. Her reputation as a journalist who once ran the Maple Creek Diner and turned it into a community hub, as seen in previous stories, made her presence significant. Her voice was one of balance, bridging skepticism and belief, facts and hope. For new viewers, her name was an invitation to explore her story, understanding how she had evolved from a waitress into a voice for ethics and transparency. As Section 7 closed, the camera panned across NASA's observation platform, catching Keanu, Linda, Jesse, and Tara standing together, watching a live feed from Voyager 1. The spacecraft had just sent back a new image, a faint, glimmering light in the vast darkness. A beacon? A glitch? Or a sign? Keanu's voice, calm and steady, concluded, "We're explorers, but before we venture farther, we need to understand ourselves." And with that, they turned back to their work, united by math, ethics, and a shared purpose. The morning sun streamed through the towering windows of Ivy League University's main auditorium. Keanu Reeves stood quietly at the back of the grand hall, his hands folded in front of him as students filed in. The once skeptical faces were now eager, respectful. At the front of the room, Professor Linda Martinez prepared her lecture materials with a soft smile. The energy in the room was different now, warmer. This was the first lecture since they had published their groundbreaking paper, Ethical Mathematics and the Future of Scientific Responsibility. The paper, co-edited by Keanu Reeves and Linda Martinez, had sent ripples through the global scientific community. They didn't just propose equations and frameworks. They advocated for an ethical standard in all advanced mathematical and technological research. Their work became a rallying cry for responsible science, a blueprint for ensuring that discoveries served humanity rather than exploited it. And today, Linda would teach her calculus students a new way of thinking. As students settled into their seats, Linda's eyes swept over them. They weren't just numbers on a roster anymore. They were young minds holding the potential to change the world. She cleared her throat softly. "Welcome back, everyone," she said. "Today, we're going to explore rocket trajectory optimization, but not just from a theoretical standpoint. We'll also talk about why we do what we do." A few students exchanged glances, surprised by the shift in tone. Linda had always been brilliant, but distant. Now she spoke with humility. Inclusivity, a sense of purpose. "In science," she continued, "we often focus on what's possible. But today, I want us to also ask, what's right?" Keanu smiled faintly from the back. She had come so far. After class, Linda gathered her things. She paused when she noticed Keanu approaching, no longer wearing his disguise. The students noticed too, their whispers buzzing through the lecture hall. "You came," Linda said. Keanu shrugged playfully. "You're better at this than I ever was." Linda smirked, but there was gratitude in her eyes. "We did something good," he corrected her, gently but firmly. "We did something right." They stood there for a moment, watching the students file out, many stopping to thank Linda, some stealing glances at Keanu with wide eyes and shy smiles. Later that afternoon in the university's Great Hall, a formal ceremony was held. Faculty, students, and dignitaries from the international scientific community gathered to honor Linda Martinez and Keanu Reeves for their contributions. President Wilson stood at the podium. His usual stiff demeanor was softened by genuine admiration. "In an age where knowledge can be a weapon or a blessing," he began, "we are fortunate to witness what happens when brilliance and responsibility meet." The applause was thunderous. Linda and Keanu accepted their awards together. Keanu wore a simple suit, understated as always. Linda's acceptance speech was humble. She thanked her students, her colleagues, and most unexpectedly, Keanu. "I misjudged him," she admitted to the crowd. "I saw a celebrity, not a scientist, but he saw potential where I saw limits. He challenged me to think differently, and together we built something better than either of us could have alone." The applause this time was quieter but more meaningful. After the ceremony, Keanu and Linda stepped outside onto the balcony overlooking the campus quad. Students mingled below, their laughter rising on the breeze. Linda exhaled deeply. "I never thought I'd be here." Keanu tilted his head. "At a university?" She chuckled. "No, in a place where I trust someone else with my work." He smiled at that. "Trust is where it starts." In the following weeks, Keanu and Linda established the Foundation for Ethical Science and Mathematics Advancement, FESMA. Its mission was clear: to fund research grounded in ethical responsibility, to protect knowledge from exploitation, and to offer scholarships to underrepresented communities in STEM fields. Their first initiative was a scholarship named after Keanu's mother and Linda's mentor. It provided full tuition and mentorship for young women in mathematical sciences. Jesse, the former Iron Serpent gang member turned NASA assistant, volunteered to lead workshops on data security. His story, shared quietly among FESMA circles, became a powerful example of redemption and purpose. Talia Reynolds, now a respected journalist and advocate, hosted FESMA's launch event. She introduced both Linda and Keanu to a new generation of thinkers. "I once ran a small-town diner," Talia shared with the audience, "and I met someone who taught me that one act of kindness can start a movement." Keanu Reeves and Linda Martinez are living proof of that. The event's live stream gained millions of views in its first day. Comments poured in from students, teachers, and scientists around the world. Hope is alive again. Science with a soul, thank you. Keanu isn't just an actor, he's a guide. On a quiet evening, Linda invited Keanu back to her classroom, this time as a guest lecturer. He walked in wearing his signature black jacket, carrying nothing but a whiteboard marker and a grin. "You're late," Linda teased. "I was thinking," he replied. "Dangerous habit." He faced the class, his tone warm. Math isn't just numbers, it's language. It's how we explain the universe to ourselves. For the next hour, Keanu walked students through trajectory optimizations, quantum math theories, and ethical considerations for future technologies. He asked hard questions. What happens if this knowledge falls into the wrong hands? What's our responsibility as thinkers, not just problem solvers? At the end, the students gave him a standing ovation. Linda clapped too, watching him with respect and quiet admiration. Weeks later, Keanu and Linda stood together on the stage of an international symposium in Geneva. They presented their joint work on ethical AI development, deep space navigation algorithms, and their ongoing research into the strange telemetry anomalies they had uncovered with NASA. They didn't give the audience all the answers, they asked better questions instead. Afterward, in a rare quiet moment, Linda asked, "Do you ever miss just being an actor?" Keanu smiled faintly. "I never stopped being one." Linda gave him a look. "You're more than that." He considered it, then nodded. "So are you?" As the story closed, the camera panned over Ivy League University's quad. Students studied under old oak trees. Drones delivered books. Solar panels gleamed atop every building. In Linda's classroom, the chalkboard still held a simple quote from their joint paper. "Knowledge is power. Wisdom is choosing how to use it." Keanu visited once more, unannounced. He sat quietly in the back row, watching Linda teach. She caught his eye, gave a nod, and kept going. They had done something good. They had done something right. And for the first time in years, Linda believed they had made the world a little safer, a little wiser. And it all started with a single equation, and a man the world had underestimated. Sometimes the greatest minds are the quietest. Sometimes genius isn't about being the loudest voice in the room or having the most impressive title. It's about listening. It's about knowing when to step forward and when to stand beside someone else and lift them up. Keanu Reeves didn't come to Linda Martinez's classroom to prove anything. He wasn't there for accolades or attention. He was there because he cared about something larger than himself, the future of knowledge, and the responsibility that comes with it. And Linda? She was someone who had dedicated her life to science, to the purity of numbers and equations, but even the sharpest minds can be clouded by assumptions. Her skepticism of Keanu wasn't personal. It was rooted in her belief that true intellect wasn't something a movie star could possess. Yet, when faced with his humility, his deep understanding, and most of all, his ethical grounding, Linda realized something profound. She had been wrong. This story wasn't just about a celebrity solving an impossible math problem. It was about two people from vastly different worlds finding common ground. They took that common ground and built something better. A framework for ethical science that prioritized humanity over fame, progress over power, and collaboration over ego. The lesson? True genius isn't measured by intellect alone. It's measured by humility, by ethics, and by the courage to act when it matters most. Keanu Reeves didn't need to prove his brilliance. He chose to use it to make a difference. Linda Martinez didn't need to hold on to her pride. She chose to let go of judgment and embrace the possibility of collaboration. Together, they changed not just their own lives, but opened doors for countless others. Their foundation, FESMA, the Foundation for Ethical Science and Mathematics Advancement, became a beacon for young minds. It offered scholarships to underprivileged students who had never dreamed they could stand in a lab, let alone change the world with an equation. Jesse, a man with a troubled past, found purpose as a mentor. Talia Reynolds, who once ran a small-town diner, became a leading voice for ethical journalism and scientific responsibility. These aren't just characters. They are symbols of something real: redemption, opportunity, and hope. The message of this incredible story is clear. Genius isn't about being right, it's about doing right. Knowledge without ethics can be dangerous, but knowledge paired with humility, courage, and compassion can transform the world. Keanu Reeves didn't just change Linda's mind, he changed the trajectory of an entire field of study. And he did it with grace, patience, and an unwavering belief that brilliance is best shared. So what can we take from this? You don't have to be Keanu Reeves or Linda Martinez to make a difference. Every day we are given chances to listen instead of judge, to collaborate instead of compete, to ask ourselves not what's possible, but what's right. In a world that often values recognition over responsibility, their story reminds us that true impact doesn't come from seeking attention, it comes from integrity. Linda once said to Keanu, "We did something good." And Keanu replied, "We did something right." That is the heart of this story. If you believe in the power of knowledge with integrity, if you believe that true genius is measured by humility, ethics, and the courage to act, then hit like, subscribe, and share this incredible story. Your support helps us bring more inspiring tales to life, stories where courage and compassion shape a better world, where people rise beyond their assumptions and work together for something greater. And remember, even the smallest act of courage, standing up for what's right, offering kindness instead of criticism, can start a ripple that changes everything. Because genius isn't about being right, it's about doing right. Thank you for watching. See you in the next incredible story.